afternoon from Nigeria. My name is Uzioma Ozulike. I'm the director of the Institute of African Studies here at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. On behalf of the Institute, I warmly welcome you to the 6th edition of our speaker series. Our ISUNN Speaker 6 is Kathryn Roman Banda of the University of New Mexico. She's joining us online from the United States. She'll be speaking with us on the topic Modeling the Terrorist Response to Economic Shocks with application to Nigeria. Kathryn Roman Banda is a dual degree doctoral candidate and Juris Doctor student in the United States. She holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics and a master's degree in economics. She primarily specializes in quantitative research methods and inferential statistics. Substantively, her contributions to political science lie at the intersection of international relations, conflict studies, peacekeeping, and law. Her work has appeared in scholarly journals such as Conflict Management and Peace Science, Perspectives on Terrorism, the Asian Journal of Peace Building, and Human Rights Quarterly, to mention but a few. Please put your hands together to welcome our speaker success today. Kathryn, we are all ears to listen to you. This topic is a very strategic one. Everyone has been waiting to listen to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Kathryn Roman Banda. I am a political science doctoral degree student at the University of New Mexico in the United States. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my dissertation research. I have studied conflicts and terrorism for several years now, and so my dissertation is the culmination of several years of research. I have published other projects that look specifically at civil wars and terrorism, the intersection of terrorism and civil wars. And so this project is an extension of that research that focuses specifically on the Central African region and Nigeria and in particular. And I just want to say briefly, I just want to give a quick shout out to Dr. Amenma, who is also on my dissertation committee. I've known him for several years now, and we've worked together, and hopefully we're going to be publishing a couple of projects together in the future. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to him for, extending this invitation and introducing me to all of you. I hope that this will not be the first or the last of our interactions. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. But I'm really hoping that we can all get to know each other, and I'm excited to collaborate and work with all of you in the future. So let's just jump right in. First, I'm just going to give you a brief outline of the topics for today's talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the project and how I got involved in this work. Then I'm going to focus on the Sahel region and talk a little bit about violence throughout Central and Western Africa. I'm going to show you some of the results of my research that involves some statistical modeling as well as some descriptive graphics that demonstrate the violence in that region. And then I'm going to hone in on Nigeria specifically and talk about the Nigerian case. So, to begin with a little background, several years ago, I was reading an international story about some politics in Nigeria, and I came across a news story that talked a little bit about how the Nigerian government had made a decision to devalue the Nigerian currency. And so I read this story, and I read about how the naira was formally fixed. It was pegged to the euro, but in 2016, the government decided to float the exchange rate. And so I read about this story in just an online periodical. I had seen this research, and I had seen pictures of what had happened with the naira when it was moved from a fixed exchange to a float. And so I had seen this and read about it, and in my mind, I thought to myself, well, that's a huge change. And so if you look at this picture, this was sort of the inspiration for my whole dissertation, actually. So you can see from the picture that the naira dramatically devalued after the change in 2016. It lost 60% of its value against the dollar in this picture. And so when I realized that this was such a dramatic change and a sudden change, and also an exogenous change, meaning a change from outside of the system, I was immediately interested. And so I knew a fair amount about Nigerian politics. I knew a little bit about terrorism in Nigeria. But after I saw this exchange rate change, I said to myself, well, how are the people in Nigeria affected by the change in the currency? And so that basically became the inspiration for my entire dissertation. My whole dissertation began with just some very superficial reading about this currency change. And then I became really interested in how do terrorist groups respond when changes like this take place. So there's a lot of economics around shocks and how shocks affect demand shocks, and how these economic changes affect regular consumers. But what we don't know is we don't know very much about how economic shocks affect political actors, specifically actors who engage in political violence. And so I was very interested in the question of, how would a violent political group respond to a big change like this? And so I decided, because this policy change took place in Nigeria, that became the inspiration for my study of the region as a whole. And so I decided to expand out from Nigeria and look at the Sahel region as a whole first, and then sort of move back in and focus specifically on Nigerian groups. And so that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. I'm going to start by discussing the region as a whole, and then I'm going to zoom back in and talk more specifically about Nigeria. Okay, so part one, let's talk a little bit about the region. This picture, by the way, I found online, but this is really interesting because what these authors are discussing with this photograph is some of the geographic and economic sort of tensions in the region. So the regions highlighted in the red slashes are areas where conflict is ongoing. As I'm sure many of you are very closely familiar, this little tiny little region around Lake Chad is the focus of a lot of my research, and Boko Haram members have been in and around that region. There are other big areas of violence that you can see throughout this part of Africa. This tri-state border region here is the focus of a lot of violence, simply because those borders are not very well maintained, and so there's a lot of violence in and around Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And then as you can see, sort of in this region here, this is the Darfur region of Sudan, which I'm sure you're also familiar with in terms of border conflicts. So there's a lot going on in this region. And so that's part of why this region became really interesting for me. One of the questions that I was interested in asking was, well, when the Nigerian government makes a change, how does that change affect other countries within the area? And so, as many of you are already familiar, Nigeria is one of the biggest, if not the biggest economy in Africa. And because the economy is so large and the country is so populous, when the government of Nigeria makes a policy change, it affects countries throughout all of Africa, really, and even the world, because Nigeria, as you're aware, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know, but Nigeria exports a lot of oil. And so when the government makes a change, the economy of Nigeria affects the economies of the countries that surround it locally within that region. And so Nigerian policy really emanates throughout Africa, really. And so I became very interested in, looking at this violence in Central Africa, understanding this violence, and then trying to ask, how might changes in the economy then affect the violence that we observe. Okay, so just to reiterate again, the Sahel region is very important for lots of reasons. Geographically, as you're aware, it's the border between the Sahara Desert and sort of the more humid savanna plains regions of the south. Economically, it's become a really important trade route, and these trade routes have existed for many, many years. So these are just some graphics that I pulled online that were published as part of other research. I did not make these graphics, but as you can see, in ancient times, African caravans would often traverse the Sahara, throughout the Sahel region, on their way to the Mediterranean, which of course becomes an access point for parts of Europe. And so this region is really, really important. As you can see in more modern times, this is from 2017, but it's still pretty relevant in terms of the movements that it's showing. What's happening in the region is that unfortunately, a lot of illicit drug trade comes from South America, enters Africa along this eastern border here, moves sort of into the interior of the continent, and then sort of like makes its way northwards. Okay, so these regions here have become really important for trade. Unfortunately, trade in a lot of arms, weapons, drugs, and people even move throughout this region on their way towards the Mediterranean. These are access points that then, lead towards Europe. And then, as you can see, again, there's Lake Chad right in the center of everything. And then a lot of the violence that we observe occurs in and around Lake Chad. And so what I want to emphasize is that this region itself is just so critical for the movement of the economy within Africa. Like, this is a very economically central area. And so trying to understand and unpack some of the violence that occurs in this part of the continent is really important, because economically, if we can cut down on the violence, there's more of an opportunity for economic growth, right? And so, unfortunately, even though a lot of, especially in this figure on the right, you can see that there's a lot of illegal trade going on, that doesn't have to be the case always, right? So it doesn't have to be illegal trade. It can be completely legitimate trade, goods trade. And these regions are just so important for the economy of Africa to grow and develop that we want to understand, well, why is the violence occurring in the way that it does, and what drives the patterns that we see? And this region in and of itself, the more I've learned about it, the more I've realized how critical it really is as a passageway to the interior of the continent, as a passageway northwards into Europe. So this is a really critical trade region, and that's also part of what motivated my interest in the political violence. And so now I just want to flip and show you, this is actually a graphic that I made. So what I did was I downloaded a shapefile of Africa, the continent, and then you can see the colored blue regions are the countries that I'm studying for this project. The population density is shown in just the region that I'm interested in. And as you can see, Nigeria really knocks it out of the park. Nigeria is the most populous, most dense region within the Sahel itself. And then in red, what I'm doing is I'm kind of denoting the terrorist violence that we see throughout the region. And those areas that I highlighted before on the other graphic, here I can just reiterate the same point insofar as you can see these dense red regions of violence. So here again is the tri-state area that I mentioned, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Here is the Lake Chad region that I mentioned, and then here is Darfur. And this is terrorist violence from 2011 to 2019. So this is 9 years of violence. And so you can see the concentration is really, really dense in Nigeria, which is also part of the reason for this project as well. Yeah, so I just want to point out briefly, the countries in the Sahel are these that are in blue. I elected to include Cameroon, which you'll see right here. This is an addition to my project. I included it because a lot of the violence around Lake Chad is in Cameroon, or is moving back and forth between the borders of Cameroon and Nigeria in that area. And so I decided to just add that country in just because I wanted the picture of the violence in that area to be complete. So, okay. So what are we doing here? What are we talking about today? So the real question that I want to ask more generally is, how do economic conditions affect political violence? And so I hypothesize that when we see economic shocks, a negative shock is actually going to cause violence to go down. So why would that be? It's almost a counterintuitive response, right? Because we know that for certain individuals, violence is the way that they express their dissatisfaction, right? So if a group has a problem with the government, they may choose to express their dissatisfaction with the government. And when economic conditions are poor, when things go badly, people lose their jobs, there tend to be more grievances against the government. And so we might anticipate that violence would go up, actually. So in certain instances, we do see this in different places throughout the world. For example, when there have been different commodities shortages, we've seen riots that have happened in different countries. In this instance, however, the reason why I'm hypothesizing that a negative economic shock is going to cause political violence to decrease is because my hypothesis is that political violence actually requires resources. And so the way that I've articulated political violence, and in fact terrorism in this case, is that I've articulated violence as an organized activity by a group of individuals that requires a certain amount of planning, communication, individuals, resources, weapons, technology. So all of these things that would be required to implement the violence itself, each of these have a cost, right? So when you want to employ people, that has a cost, right? When you want to deploy weapons, acquiring those weapons have a cost. All of these things have costs. And so my hypothesis is that when the economy is in a slump and conditions are poor, my hypothesis is that people have less money that they are willing to spend. And so because they have less income coming in, my hypothesis is that violence itself will go down. Not because people have fewer grievances, they actually might have more grievances, right? But in the net effect, I predict, is that when there's less money coming into an economy, then I predict that violence will actually decrease as a result. Why? Because people have less money to spend on the implements of that violence, right? So people would like to be committing the same level of violence, but let's say they can't afford to hire the individuals to plan an event, or they can't afford to purchase the weapons that they would need to commit that violence. And so I hypothesize that violence actually goes down when conditions are poor. And so this is my basic sort of organizing research question and my hypothesis for the project. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about what the economy was doing in and around that currency change. So these are graphics that I made that just demonstrate different factors within the Sahel region. As you can see, the Naira exchange rate, which I showed you before, dramatically changed in the middle of 2016. But when we look behind the exchange rate change, we see that what was really happening in and around that same time was that there was a huge recession going on in the region as a whole, and in Nigeria in particular. So for most of you, this is probably pretty evident, and you've known about this all your lives. You live in Nigeria, you're from Nigeria. But for me, I'm learning about all of this for the first time. And so when I read about this currency change here that took place here, at first I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that's a huge economic shock. I want to study that. I want to see how that affected people's behavior in the region. But then when I did more research, I realized that the shock itself, which took place right about here, was already when the country and the region as a whole was already experiencing a huge recession due to the global price of oil. So as you're aware, Nigeria exports a lot of oil, and so when the price of oil drops, it hits the economy pretty hard. And that's what's happening here. As you can see in 2014, very late in 2014, and then all the way into 2016, there was a huge slump in global oil prices. Brent crude is the price of oil as it's traded on the European market. And this is just a graphic that shows that the price of oil was dropping dramatically. When this price of oil dropped for whatever reason, this causes a huge recession in the economy. And so if we look together at these two diagrams and we put them together, what we see is, in fact, what the Nigerian government is doing is they moved the currency up just a little bit here, just to give a little bit of recession relief, basically. And then they moved it up again. They allowed it to float completely later in 2016, and that's when it jumped up right here. So this is where it's just completely devaluing, right? But each of these movements, if we look at the movements of the currency against the movement of global oil prices, we see what's really happening, and that is that the economy was already in a recession, and the government's just trying to give some relief to the inflated currency, right? Okay, so we kind of have a sense of what's happening in the economy in Nigeria and in the region, but what does that mean for terrorism? What does that mean for political violence? And so here's a graphic that shows you the political violence in the region. Unfortunately, it's not very illustrative. So when we look at political violence in the region, it doesn't really look as if there's some huge, slowdown in the violence that would directly correlate with what's happening in these two indicators, right? So this is the real question, is it doesn't necessarily look like violence is responsive to these economic shocks, these economic indicators, right? It doesn't really look just at face value. When we look at the terrorism for the whole region, it doesn't really look like there's a relationship. But, numbers can be deceiving. We don't always know. So then the next question is, if I look more closely at this data, can I see whether or not there's any type of relationship between these shocks that are taking place? And so when I say these shocks that are taking place, what I really mean is there a relationship between this recession that was occurring due to oil prices and the terrorist attacks that were happening in the region? Is there a relationship between what is happening with the Nigerian currency in 2016? Is there a relationship between this huge currency shock and what is happening in the region? So that's the real question that we're asking or the question that I'm asking is, can I see a relationship between the economics going on over here and the political violence that's going on over here? So at face value, at first pass, it doesn't really look like there's anything dramatically going on. But to really see whether or not there's an answer to that question, I'm going to have to use statistics. So that's what I did. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the modeling of this process. So again, same 9 years going on here. This is just two versions of the same graphic. This is the full graphic, so you can see this is a negative binomial model. I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions. I'm going to run through it pretty quickly here. So this is the full model here, and then this is just me zooming in on this top portion of the model, right? And so if I look at the nested model itself, what it shows me is that these are the variables that are really affecting the political violence throughout the region as a whole. So when I say, what can we understand about the predictors of political violence? Well, this model suggests that the predictors, if I control for population density, right, which is kind of like controlling for per capita attacks, it's controlling for, where I would expect more attacks because there are more people. If I control for population density and I control for attacks in the prior month, that just means I'm controlling for connectedness over time. I'm controlling for autocorrelation. If I control for these two things, the bookends on either side, then I can highlight these things in the center and I can say, okay, it seems to me as though there might be a relationship between employment, the exchange rate in Nigeria, export share, that's the economic sort of health of the economy, and government spending, right? And so when I look at these variables in particular, these 4 variables that I'm trying to understand, I can see that the exchange rate is negatively correlated with violence, which is consistent with what I had predicted. So keep in mind, as the exchange rate goes up, meaning the exchange rate is devalued, the value of the naira dropped dramatically in 2016. As the exchange rate is devalued, we see that in general, violence in the Sahel region goes down, which is what we would predict. So as income, the exchange rate is devalued, income goes down, violence also goes down with it. So that is consistent with what I would predict. Now, if you notice, however, notice what is not included on this side of the graphic, and that is the Brent price of crude oil. So it's in my model down here, right? But it's not actually statistically significant, which means that the price of crude oil didn't have a significant relationship with terrorism over that time period, right? Which is interesting because we can say that this policy change, which only really took place in Nigeria, this policy change actually had some type of correlative relationship with violence in the region. However, the oil prices did not. And so that's significant because obviously we know that the policy change was limited to Nigeria, and yet we see that the policy change in Nigeria had an effect on the region as a whole. Now, take this with a grain of salt because, obviously the violence is most dense in Nigeria already. So when I say the entire region, we're really talking about Nigeria and like some friends, right? So don't, let's not overinterpret these results. But, this modeling tends to suggest that the Nigerian policy change, when we control for other factors, was still relevant for terrorism throughout the region. In fact, not only was it relevant, but it may have been more relevant than the effect of oil prices. And so that's a pretty important distinction, I think. Okay, so let's focus in on Nigeria. We're going to talk specifically about Nigerian groups. So what I did was I decided to focus specifically on two groups that are not only in Nigeria, but also throughout the region. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Boko Haram. Sorry, that should be capitalized. I'm going to talk a little bit about Boko Haram and the Fulani extremists. And so I'm going to discuss these two groups within the discussion of Nigeria. Okay, so I basically took the same model and I ran the same model that we looked at for the Sahel region. I ran that model again, looking only at Nigerian terrorist attacks. Okay, so then the question is, do we see the same effects? Right? Do we see the same effects of oil? Do we see the same effects of the currency devaluation? Right? And so when I look only at Nigerian terrorist attacks, again, this is just the same exact model. I have the full binomial model on the left, and then I'm zooming in just to this upper portion on the right here. When I ran the model just looking only at Nigerian groups, we see that the only thing that is really closely connected in a predictive sense, closely connected with terrorism within Nigeria is actually the export share, believe it or not. So in the model of Nigeria, the oil prices fall out. So the oil prices are over here, they fall out, and the Naira also falls out. Right? So that's an interesting finding because, I would like to know, well, why would it be that the Naira exchange rate would have such an effect within the region as a whole, but then less of an apparent effect within Nigeria? And so that's a question that I can't fully answer right now, but I present that to you, to discuss. And so when we look closely at Nigeria, this is just a quick graphic that goes over some of the things. This looks like a whole mess, but it's really just attempting to show you a little bit of the modeling that I was doing. So in addition to a negative binomial model, I also did what is known as a structural break model to see if perhaps instead of modeling these variables as lines with slopes, I could model them as sort of a piecewise function of many different lines. So instead of having one line, this structural break model allows me to create several lines. And so here you can see I have a couple of things going on. It looks like a mishmash. But in green is the currency. So this is the Naira. And the structural breaks really follow the currency, right? You can see export share is here in blue. This is the price of, this in red is the price of the crude oil, right? And then in yellow are the terrorist attacks. And you can kind of see that the terrorist attacks seem to peak here, and then they go down again during the recession, which is kind of what I would have predicted for this model. So let's go in statistically and see if we can pull anything out of this mishmash of relationships. So what I did is I created a structural break model. Again, I'm going to just glide very smoothly over the modeling here. I'm happy to answer any questions later on about what I did and what this entails. Basically, I'm letting the software choose the breaks for me. So I create the data set, I clean the data, but then I don't analyze it myself. In this particular model, I'm using Stata, and so I permit the model to be sort of chosen by the software, and so the software is analyzing it for me and finding the breaks. Once I find the breaks, then I go back in and input the breaks into the data and then run these three separate models, right? So there are two structural breaks, meaning I have three different time periods. And so if we look quickly at these time periods, I don't want to dwell on this too long, but if we look quickly at these time periods, we can see that the exchange rate really made a difference prior to when the recession was sort of hitting. And then when we get into the recession, which is sort of in here, we see that oil prices mattered during the recession, which is what we would predict, right? So when oil prices dramatically dropped, the economy is in a recession. We see a positive relationship between oil prices and terrorist attacks, which is what we would expect. As oil prices go up, income increases, violence increases. That's what we're seeing in this second panel here. But then when we move into the third panel and we're kind of coming out of the recession, then our predictors don't really have a relationship at all. So both the exchange rate and the oil prices sort of fall out in this third period, right? And so this is not fully, I wouldn't say that this model answers all the questions, right? So, we can see that oil prices seem to matter in these first two panels, and then it goes away in the third panel. Similarly, you can see that the exchange rate initially matters for the first panel, and then during the recession, it seems to drop out and go away. So those are questions that I can't fully unpack with this data, but I think it's really interesting to see that the contribution of the variables is literally changing over time, which is what we would expect when we see that the economy goes into this dramatic recession, right? Okay. So my question within Nigeria, so now I've looked kind of at the variables more generally, and I want to take sort of like a closer look at groups that are within Nigeria specifically. And so, as I mentioned before, I'm looking at two groups, Boko Haram and the Fulani extremists. So if you know anything about these groups, I picked them because the groups themselves are very heterogeneous. So they're very different groups, right? So Boko Haram is a very, they're a Sunni extremist Islamic group. They're very well connected. So this group is very highly connected to other groups within Africa. They're also highly connected to other groups within the Middle East and throughout the world, right? So this group basically has a lot of money. They're very well organized. Their political goal is to establish an Islamic State. So they're an extension of the Islamic State, and they're trying to basically foster a regime change within Nigeria. This is a very well organized, well established, well funded international terrorist group, right? And so I'm contrasting the Boko Haram with another group that is kind of the opposite in terms of their agenda. And so I picked the Fulani extremists. I could have picked several other groups, but I like them because they're just so completely different than Boko Haram. The Fulani, as you know, are an ethnic group. Not all of them are extremists, but the extremists have sort of begun committing these violent acts against other farmers whom they feel are encroaching on their grazing lands as they're moving north and south seasonally to graze their herds. And so the Fulani don't necessarily have an explicit political goal. Their goal is really just to maintain their nomadic grazing lands and their nomadic lifestyle. And that's what makes them so fascinating, is that they're not as well organized. They're not an international group. They're primarily regional. They're an ethnic group that's existed for centuries. They haven't always been violent. They've been kind of radicalized in very recent years, and they don't have an overt political goal. Their goal is really just to maintain their lifestyle. And so the question is, when we compare these two groups together, the question is, do the resources of the group itself have an effect on the way that group would respond to economic conditions? So if there is a recession in the economy, we would expect that a terrorist group with lots of money and lots of connections is probably going to lean pretty hard on its connections. They're going to lean pretty hard on the money that they have coming in. They're going to solicit donations from abroad. They're going to lean really hard on their friends and relatives and cohorts to fund them, essentially, to sort of buffer them from the recession. Whereas what I would predict is that more localized, more regionalized, more traditional groups like the Fulani extremists do not have the same type of resources. And so because they're not as well connected and not as well funded, I expect that a recession is going to hit that group more intensely than it would with Boko Haram. And so the question that I want to ask is, do the resources of these groups affect the intensity of their response when there's a recession, right? Or when there are economic shocks, right? So the question is, do the financial resources mediate the relationship between the shocks and the violence, right? And so I hypothesize that terrorist groups with fewer resources are going to be more strongly affected. So just to put that in practical terms, I hypothesize that a group like Boko Haram is very international, and they're going to be able to shield themselves effectively from an economic recession, whereas a group like the Fulani extremists are not as international, not as well connected, and so they're going to be hit more intensely. They're going to be hit harder by a recession. They're going to be hit harder by negative economic shocks. So then the question is, can we observe this in the data, right? Okay. So another way of thinking about this is, I'm not going to get into the theory, the economic theory very much, but another way of thinking about this is to think a little bit about the elasticity of demand. So if demand for terrorist violence is highly related to income, then we would expect that demand is going to go down a lot when there's a recession. And so that's kind of like what we would see with the Fulani, whereas they're going to be hit really hard. And so when there's a very strong hit to their income, their terrorist violence is going to go down a lot. Whereas with Boko Haram, we would expect the opposite. In other words, we would expect that their demand for violence is not going to change as much. Meaning, when it doesn't change as much, I hypothesize that demand is less elastic. So I don't have time to really go into the theory behind this. These are just some basic economic diagrams, and I'm happy to answer questions about these if you would like to get into that more later on. So just to give you a sense of what these groups are doing, this is the Fulani within the Sahel, and then just to contrast, this is Boko Haram within the Sahel. These are graphics that I made similar to the previous. I looked at types of attacks that these groups commit. So this is a breakdown of the types of attacks. As you can see, Boko Haram is committing more attacks on the whole, but just keep in mind that this is over a 9-year period. So their violence has actually evolved and changed over time. If we were to look at it year by year, you would see a different set of variation. Mainly, they're committing assaults. There's some bombing going on and kidnapping. So what I did with this breakdown of violence is I actually looked at the violence itself, and I said to myself, okay, if I were going to commit terrorist violence during a recession, which things would I want to do which might actually help me in a recession? And so my reasoning was that some of these hostage takings, these kidnappings for ransom, would actually be a source of revenue for these groups if they were to engage in them, right? And so I hypothesized that these types of violence in here, when they hijack, let's say they hijack a car or a plane or a bus, when they hijack, they take something, right, or they kidnap someone for ransom. These are acts in which they might actually derive a profit of some sort from this type of violence, right? So, in a way, some violence can be profitable for the group itself, whereas other violence really doesn't generate any type of profit. So let's say a group decides that they're going to bomb a government building. That would be an act of violence that may serve a political purpose, but there really wouldn't be any revenue associated with it, right? So you bomb the building is taken out, you've made your point politically, but have you gained anything from that explosion? Probably not, right? So what I'm doing is I'm trying to think about the violence itself and think about, what are these groups extracting from these events? Are they extracting any type of economic benefit? And so all I did was I took the violence itself and broke it into two categories that demonstrate whether or not the group itself derives any type of economic benefit from the violence. And so if we look and we compare the violence of the two groups, what we see is that revenue generating violence, in other words, violence that has the ability to create some type of profit for these groups, right? So I kidnap an individual, I hold them for ransom, I get the ransom money, and that serves as income for my group, right? So what we see is that Boko Haram stays pretty consistent in terms of the violence, the types of violence that they're using, and whether or not they're using revenue generating violence. In contrast, so what I observed is that the revenue generating violence by the Fulani extremists seems to go up and up and up over time, right? And that's consistent with the idea that, perhaps they're responding to the recession positively. Now, I can't rule out the idea that this increase might have been caused by other factors, right? So there's some literature that suggests that the Fulani in particular have been radicalized by other groups and that their violence has become more intense over time. So I can't really unpack the full reasons why these changes are occurring just with this graphic. But superficially, this would tend to suggest that the Fulani did start using different types of violence. In particular, they started using violence that might generate revenue for them, and this increased in and around the time that the economy was in a recession. And so if we just place those two groups together, this is just a similar graphic that shows this is when the policy change took place in Nigeria. This is a comparison of the revenue generating violence by both groups. As you can see, the Boko Haram in green stayed pretty consistent, right? And then right in and around the time when that policy change occurred, that's when the Fulani really stepped it up and they started increasing their revenue generating attacks. And so that does give some superficial support to the idea that these groups are reacting to economic conditions, and that when the economy is in a slump, the groups themselves tend to perhaps engage in less violence overall, but the violence that they do choose to commit is actually violence that might generate some type of profit for them. So on the whole, I would say that this research gives tentative support to the idea that during an economic slump, terrorist groups do tend to engage in less violence because they have less income. In addition, what I found is that when I compare Boko Haram, which has a lot of resources, with another group, the Fulani extremists, who have fewer resources, I find that groups with fewer resources tend to engage in more revenue generating violence when there is an economic slump, when there are negative economic shocks. And so that's all I have. Thank you so much for inviting me. I very much hope that this is the beginning of a relationship between us, and I welcome all of your questions. Thank you so much.